Some sins are written in the stars long before they're ever committed. England, in the year of our Lord 1173. A time when stone castles rose like prayers from the earth, when the word of Rome held more power than any king's decree, and when a woman's fate was decided not by her heart, but by her father's debts. This is the world where our tale unfolds, in the shadow of Ravenswood Manor, where the ancient oaks whisper secrets to those brave enough to listen, and where love would soon commit the most unforgivable transgression of all. Hello, friend. If you're enjoying this romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like and a subscribe. My mum said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers, let's prove her wrong and make it happen. It will also help me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you don't mind, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every comment and it always brings a smile to my face. Now let's get back to this amazing story. Chapter 1. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood at her chamber window that autumn morning, watching the mist curl around the parish church like ghostly fingers beckoning her forward. She was 22 years old, which in the unforgiving arithmetic of medieval England meant she was dangerously close to becoming unmarriageable, a burden, a failure. Her father, Edward Ashford, Earl of Ravenswood, had once commanded respect across 3 counties, his bannermen numerous, his coffers full. But pride, as it so often does, had led him down a treacherous path, and now those same coffers echoed with emptiness. The tapestries that once adorned the great hall had been sold. The silver plate, melted down. Even Eleanor's mother's jewels had found their way into creditors' hands, one ruby at a time, one pearl, one desperate transaction after another. But there was one debt that could not be paid in precious stones. Lord William Blackthorne, Baron of Thornfield, had lent the Earl a sum so vast that only one currency remained valuable enough to settle the account. A daughter. Eleanor had learned of her betrothal 3 weeks prior, announced at dinner as casually as one might discuss the weather. Her father had not met her eyes. Her mother had simply nodded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if Eleanor were merely a fine mare being traded to settle a gambling debt. And perhaps that's exactly what she was. Sir Gareth Blackthorne, her intended, had visited twice since the arrangement was made. He was a man of 30 years, broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, who looked at Eleanor the way a merchant appraises livestock, calculating her worth in heirs and obedience. During his second visit, he had cornered her in the solar, his breath reeking of wine, and told her explicitly what he expected from a wife. The words still made her skin crawl. But Eleanor was her father's daughter, raised on duty and sacrifice, taught from birth that a woman's purpose was to serve, to submit, to save her family's honor even if it meant destroying her own soul in the process. It was this suffocating desperation that drove her to the church that first time. The church of St. Michael stood at the edge of the village, its Norman tower reaching toward heaven like a stone finger pointing the way to salvation. Eleanor had always found comfort in the cool darkness of the sanctuary, in the smell of incense and beeswax, in the rhythmic cadence of Latin prayers that seemed to carry mortal troubles up and away to God's infinite mercy. But on this particular morning, it wasn't Mass she sought. It was confession. She needed to speak aloud the terror that had been building in her chest like floodwaters against a failing dam. She needed someone, anyone, to hear her before she drowned. The confessional booth was ancient oak, dark and enclosed, with a wooden screen separating sinner from priest. Eleanor knelt in the shadows, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the partition. She waited, and then she heard movement on the other side, the rustle of fabric, the creak of wood. And then a voice. "Speak, my child, and be unburdened." It was not Father Benedict's weathered rasp that greeted her. This voice was younger, warmer, threaded with a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in the stern architecture of confession. Eleanor hesitated, then began. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 2 weeks since my last confession, and I am troubled in spirit." The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling over themselves like water finally breaching that dam. She told him about the betrothal, about Sir Gareth's cruelty, about the crushing weight of duty pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She told him she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, and that she was ashamed of her lack of acceptance, ashamed that she could not simply bow her head and embrace her fate as every good Christian woman should. On the other side of that wooden screen, Father Thomas Whitmore listened. He was 28 years old, new to this parish, sent by the bishop to replace Father Benedict, who had finally succumbed to age and ailment. Thomas had been raised in a monastery after his parents died of fever when he was but 5 years old. The monks had been his family, the scriptures his education, and the priesthood his salvation. He had taken his vows with genuine devotion, believing absolutely in the sacred covenant between God and his servants. He had never questioned his calling. Not once. Not until this moment. There was something in Lady Eleanor's voice that reached through the darkness and the wood and the centuries of ecclesiastical authority to touch something he had thought long buried beneath layers of prayer and discipline. It wasn't her beauty, which he had glimpsed only briefly during Massachusetts. It was her honesty. Her raw, unvarnished fear. The way she spoke of feeling trapped reminded him of his own childhood, locked in the monastery, grateful for his salvation but sometimes wondering what freedom might taste like. He found himself responding not with the standard platitudes and scriptural references he had been trained to dispense, but with genuine compassion. "My lady," he said softly, and he did not realize until later that he should not have acknowledged her rank, should have maintained the anonymity of confession, "you are not sinning by feeling fear." Our Lord himself sweated blood in Gethsemane, knowing what awaited him. To be afraid is to be human. To voice that fear is courage, not weakness. Eleanor's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her this way. Not her mother, who counseled silent endurance. Not her younger brother Thomas, who was too young to understand. Certainly not her father, who saw her only as a solution to his problems. This priest, this stranger separated from her by nothing more than a lattice of wood, had seen her. Truly seen her. When she left the confessional that morning, stepping back into the autumn sunlight, something had shifted in the architecture of her world. She did not know it yet, but she had just taken the first step toward her own undoing. She returned 3 days later. And then again 4 days after that. Each time, she told herself it was for spiritual guidance, that she needed the church's wisdom to prepare for her marriage, to make peace with her fate. And each time, Father Thomas was there, listening with that same gentle attention, offering counsel that seemed to understand not just her duty but her heart. They spoke of scripture, yes, but also of philosophy, of the nature of free will and divine purpose. It happened in the garden behind the church, where roses still bloomed despite the lateness of the season. Eleanor had escaped there seeking quiet, overwhelmed by the noise and false cheer of the celebration. She was examining a blood-red rose, its petals already beginning to curl with approaching frost, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She turned, and there he was. Father Thomas Whitmore, no longer a disembodied voice but a man of flesh and bone, tall and lean with eyes the color of a winter sea and dark hair that fell across his forehead despite his efforts to control it. They stared at each other, and Eleanor felt the world tilt sideways. This was the man she had confessed her deepest fears to. This was the man whose voice had become her only comfort. And he was looking at her with an expression that mirrored everything she was feeling, everything she had tried so desperately to deny. "My lady," he said, and his voice shook slightly. "I did not mean to intrude. I was just..." He gestured vaguely toward the church, unable to complete the sentence. Eleanor knew she should excuse herself, should maintain propriety, should do anything except stand there drinking in the sight of him. But her feet would not move. "I wanted to thank you, Father," she heard herself saying, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. "Your counsel has been the only light in a very dark time." Thomas stepped closer, and the scent of him reached her, incense and ink and something indefinably him. "You need not thank me. I have only done my duty." But they both knew that was a lie. What had happened between them in that confessional had transcended duty weeks ago. They stood there in the garden, the sounds of celebration distant and dreamlike, the roses bleeding red around them, and everything unspoken rose up between them like a living thing. Thomas spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "I pray for you every night, Lady Eleanor. I speak your name to God and ask Him to grant you peace, to grant you happiness, to protect you from suffering." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "And I think of you," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think of our conversations, of your voice, of the way you listen as if my words actually matter. You have made me feel seen, Father Thomas. For the first time in my life, someone has truly seen me." The distance between them was closing, neither quite aware they were moving. Thomas raised his hand as if to touch her face, then stopped, his fingers hovering in the air between them. "This is wrong," he said, but his hand did not move away. "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I am sworn to God," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I have nothing to offer you but damnation." Eleanor looked up at him, and in her eyes was everything, all the longing and despair and impossible hope of a soul recognizing its other half. "Then we are both already damned, Father, for I cannot stop my heart from what it knows to be true." They were a breath apart now, close enough that Eleanor could see the pulse hammering in his throat, close enough that Thomas could count the gold flecks in her brown eyes. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, trembling with the weight of a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. And then, voices. Footsteps approaching on the gravel path. They sprang apart like guilty children, and Eleanor's brother rounded the corner, calling her name. The spell was broken. The moment passed. But as Eleanor hurried away, following her brother back to the safety of the crowd, she glanced back once. Father Thomas stood among the roses like a statue of grief, and in that glance, they both understood. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. The impossible had become inevitable, and somewhere in the distance, the wedding bells were already beginning to toll. So I ask you now, dear listener, knowing what we know of duty and desire, of sacred vows and earthly love, what would you do? If your heart called you toward damnation, would you have the strength to turn away? Or would you, like Eleanor and Thomas, take that first step into the unknown, knowing that some paths, once chosen, can never be unwalked? Chapter 2. Father Thomas Whitmore did something that night that no priest in Ravenswood's history had ever done. He walked into the bishop's chambers and begged to be transferred to another parish. The lamplight flickered across the bishop's weathered face as he studied the young priest before him, noting the gaunt cheeks, the shadows beneath his eyes, the tremor in his hands. "You wish to leave?" the bishop asked, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in service to Rome. "After only 3 months. This is most unusual, Father Thomas." Thomas could not meet his superior's gaze. How could he explain that remaining in Ravenswood felt like standing in a burning building, that every day brought fresh agony, that he was drowning in feelings he had no right to possess? "I feel I could serve God better elsewhere, Your Grace. Perhaps in a larger parish, or among the poor in London, where my education might be of greater use." The bishop leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and Thomas felt those ancient eyes boring into his soul, seeing everything he was trying so desperately to hide. "A priest does not flee his post because the work is difficult, Father Thomas. A shepherd does not abandon his flock at the first sign of wolves. Your request is denied." The words fell like a death sentence. Thomas returned to his sparse cell that night knowing he was trapped, knowing that every Sunday Eleanor would sit in those pews, knowing that the wooden confessional screen was the only barrier between his vows and his damnation, and that barrier was growing thinner with each passing day. He did what he always did in moments of crisis. He prayed. But for the first time in his life, the prayers felt hollow, words thrown into an empty void that returned no comfort, no guidance, only silence. Meanwhile, in Ravenswood Manor, Eleanor was fighting her own desperate battle. She had made a decision in that garden, standing so close to Father Thomas that she could feel the heat of his body, could see her own longing reflected in his eyes. She would not return to the confessional. She would not see him, speak to him, think of him. She would starve these impossible feelings until they withered and died, and she would marry Sir Gareth as duty demanded. It was the only way. The only righteous path. But the human heart, as we all know, does not obey commands as readily as we might wish. 6 weeks until the wedding. That's all the time she had left. 6 weeks to transform herself into the kind of woman who could share a bed with Sir Gareth Blackthorne without wanting to claw her own skin off. 6 weeks to forget the sound of Father Thomas's voice, the way he said her name, the almost touch in the garden that had felt more intimate than any kiss. She threw herself into wedding preparations with manic determination. She sat for hours while seamstresses pinned and tucked her wedding gown, a magnificent creation of ivory silk and seed pearls that cost more than most villagers would earn in a lifetime. She learned to embroider the blackthorn crest, those cruel blackthorns twisted into a crown. She memorized the names of Sir Gareth's relatives, studied the layout of Thornfield Manor where she would spend the rest of her days, practiced smiling demurely while her future husband discussed her as if she were a prized mare. And every night, she lay awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling, trying not to remember the garden, trying not to wonder if Father Thomas was also lying awake, if he was thinking of her the way she was thinking of him, if he was suffering as much as she was. The answer, had she known it, was yes. Thomas had stopped eating properly. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. He performed his duties mechanically, leading Mass with a voice that cracked on the Latin verses, hearing confessions from villagers whose sins seemed so wonderfully simple compared to the war raging in his own soul. Old widow Margaret had gossiped. Young William had stolen apples. These were sins he could absolve with a few prayers and a lecture. But how did one absolve the sin of loving someone you had no right to love? How did one perform penance for wanting to break sacred vows, for lying awake at night imagining a different life, a different world where he was not bound to celibacy and she was not promised to another man? Then came the moment that changed everything. Eleanor's father, the earl, in a final gesture of paternal tradition, insisted that his daughter make a full and complete confession before her wedding day. It was an old custom in the Ashford family, a spiritual cleansing before embarking on married life. Eleanor tried to refuse, claiming she had been confessing regularly, but her father was immovable. "You will go to St. Michael's tomorrow at noon," he commanded, "and you will confess everything, that you might enter your marriage with a pure soul and an unburdened heart." The irony was so bitter Eleanor nearly laughed. A pure soul. An unburdened heart. If only he knew. She walked to the church the next day like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. Each step felt heavier than the last. The autumn had given way to early winter, and frost crunched beneath her feet. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls gray against the iron sky, and she knew with absolute certainty that Father Thomas would be waiting on the other side of that wooden screen. This would be the last time. The final confession. And then she would close that chapter of her life forever. She entered the confessional booth, the familiar smell of old wood and incense washing over her like a wave of memory. She knelt in the darkness and waited. The silence stretched, taut and terrible. Then she heard him. "Bless me, for I have sinned." His voice was rough, as if he had been shouting or crying or both. Eleanor closed her eyes against the tears that threatened to spill. "Father Thomas," she whispered, abandoning all pretense of anonymity. "I should not be here. I cannot be here. This is the last time. It has to be." On the other side of the screen, Thomas pressed his palm flat against the wood, wishing desperately that he could touch her, that there was no barrier between them, that the world was anything other than what it was. "I know," he said, and his voice was filled with such anguish that Eleanor had to bite her lip to keep from sobbing. "I have tried to stop thinking of you. I have prayed until my knees bled. I have fasted and begged God to take this burden from me. But Lady Eleanor, I fear I am not strong enough. I fear that I am failing both you and God, and I do not know how to find my way back to righteousness." Eleanor's hands gripped the edge of the kneeler until her knuckles went white. "Then we must be strong for each other," she said, her voice shaking. "You will give me your blessing for this marriage, and I will go forward with courage, and we will both serve as we are called to serve. This is what must happen. This is the only way. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies. There was no strength sufficient for what they were being asked to endure. There was no blessing that could make Sir Gareth's touch bearable. There was no courage great enough to face a lifetime without hope. Thomas knew it too. He gave her the blessing because she asked for it, speaking the Latin words that rang hollow in his own ears. And when Eleanor rose to leave, she paused at the confessional door. "In another life, Father Thomas," she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear. "In another life, perhaps we could have been happy." And then she was gone, leaving Thomas alone in the darkness, his face wet with tears he had not realized he was crying. 3 weeks until the wedding. The manor was in chaos with final preparations. Musicians had been hired. The feast menu had been planned down to the last detail. Guests were beginning to arrive from neighboring estates. And then, 2 nights before all of this frenetic activity reached its crescendo, something happened that would throw everything into question. Sir Gareth Blackthorne, drunk on wine and entitlement, cornered a young serving girl in the manor's kitchen and forced himself upon her. The girl's screams brought other servants running, and Sir Gareth, realizing he had been caught, threw coin at the girl and stormed out, laughing about his rights as a nobleman. The servants whispered among themselves, horror mixing with helplessness. What could they do? He was a baron's son. The girl was nobody. This was simply the way of the world. But one of those servants was loyal to Lady Eleanor. An older woman named Margaret who had been Eleanor's nurse as a child. She came to Eleanor's chamber that night and told her everything. Eleanor listened in silence, and with each word, something inside her crystallized into certainty. This was the man she was meant to marry. This monster. This creature who saw women as objects to be used and discarded. And in 6 weeks, in 6 months, in 6 years, it would be Eleanor screaming in the darkness while he exercised his marital rights. Margaret finished her tale and looked at her lady with eyes that held both pity and resignation. "I thought you should know, my lady. I thought you deserved to know what manner of man he truly is." Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was cold as winter steel. "Thank you, Margaret. You may go." Alone in her chamber, Eleanor walked to her window and looked out toward the village, toward the church whose tower rose above the humble roofs like a beacon. Father Thomas was there, she knew. Perhaps awake like her. Perhaps staring into the darkness and wondering how they had arrived at this impossible juncture. And suddenly, Eleanor understood something she had been refusing to acknowledge. There are moments in life when duty becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction. There are times when obedience to the world's demands requires the murder of one's own soul. Her father had sold her to pay his debts. Sir Gareth would use her body and discard her humanity. The church preached submission and suffering as virtues. But what if they were all wrong? What if there was another way? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Eleanor had been raised to be obedient, to sacrifice, to accept her lot without question. But standing there in the darkness, something rebellious and fierce awakened in her chest. She thought of Father Thomas's words in the confessional, about praying for her happiness, about wanting to protect her from suffering. She thought about the garden, about the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious and irreplaceable. And she made a decision that would have consequences neither of them could possibly foresee. Meanwhile, in the church, Father Thomas was experiencing his own dark revelation. News of Sir Gareth's assault had reached him through a servant who came seeking counsel for the traumatized girl. Thomas listened to the tale with growing horror, and then, alone in the sanctuary, he raged at God with a fury he had never before allowed himself to feel. "Is this your will?" he shouted into the empty church, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "That good women should be sacrificed to monsters? That I should stand here in my robes and bless this union while knowing what awaits her? What kind of God demands such suffering? What kind of faith requires such complicity?" The silence that answered him was damning. For the first time in his life, Thomas understood that perhaps his vows of obedience, his surrender of personal will, his commitment to the church's authority, perhaps all of it had been a kind of cowardice. It was easier to follow rules than to follow conscience. Safer to hide behind tradition than to stand up for what was right. And Eleanor was going to pay the price for his weakness, for his fear, for his inability to choose love over duty. But what could he do? He was one priest against centuries of ecclesiastical power. He had no money, no position, nothing to offer Eleanor except disgrace and ruin. If he broke his vows, he would be excommunicated, cast out, condemned to hell itself according to the very doctrine he had dedicated his life to teaching. And Eleanor, if she refused the marriage, would destroy her family. Her father would lose everything. Her mother and brother would be left destitute. The weight of all those lives pressed down on Thomas like a physical force, crushing him into the cold stone floor where he knelt in desperate prayer. The day before the wedding, Eleanor's younger brother found her in the library. Thomas Ashford was 16, old enough to understand the world's cruelties but young enough to still believe in the possibility of justice. He had watched his sister grow pale and hollow-eyed over the past months. He had noticed the way she stared at the church during meals, the way she flinched whenever Sir Gareth's name was mentioned. And he had noticed something else, something he wasn't quite sure he understood but felt compelled to address. "Eleanor," he said, closing the library door behind him. "I need to speak with you, and I need you to be honest with me." Eleanor looked up from the book she had been pretending to read. "What is it, Tommy?" Her brother sat down across from her, his young face serious beyond his years. "It's about Father Thomas. I've seen the way you look toward the church. I've heard you crying at night. And I saw you both in the garden at the festival. Eleanor, please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me there's nothing between you and the priest." The question hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor could lie. She should lie. But looking at her brother's earnest face, she found she no longer had the strength for deception. "I love him," she whispered, and saying the words aloud for the first time felt like both liberation and damnation. "God help me, Tommy, I love him, and I think he loves me too, and I don't know what to do because tomorrow I'm supposed to marry Sir Gareth and I think it might kill me, not my body but my soul, and I'm so frightened I can barely breathe." Thomas Ashford sat back, processing this confession. He should be shocked. He should be appalled. A priest and his sister, it was unthinkable, impossible, wrong in every way that mattered. But instead, all he felt was a fierce protective anger toward the system that would force his brilliant, kind sister into the arms of a brute like Sir Gareth while the man she actually loved was forbidden to her by religious decree. "Then don't marry him," Thomas said simply. Eleanor laughed, a bitter sound. "And destroy our family? Let father lose everything? Condemn mother and you to poverty? I cannot be so selfish." Her brother leaned forward, his young eyes blazing with conviction. "Is it selfish to refuse to be sacrificed? Eleanor, I've heard the servants talk about Sir Gareth. I know what he did. If you marry him, you'll die, maybe not tomorrow or next year, but slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of the sister I love. Is that what father would truly want? Is that what any of us should want?" The question echoed in Eleanor's mind long after her brother left the library. That night, she could not sleep. She paced her chamber, watching the moon trace its arc across the sky, counting down the hours until dawn, until the wedding, until the moment when she would have to walk down that aisle and place her hand in Sir Gareth's and speak vows that would bind her to him until death. Unless. The word whispered through her mind like a dangerous prayer. Unless she chose differently. Unless she was brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to reach for something else. But what? Run away alone? She would be hunted down, dragged back in disgrace. Refuse the marriage? Her father would be ruined. There seemed no path forward that did not lead to destruction. And yet, somewhere in the darkness, a small voice whispered that sometimes destruction is the only path to freedom. In his cell at the church, Father Thomas was also awake, also wrestling with impossible choices. On his small wooden desk lay a letter, already sealed, already prepared. It was addressed to Eleanor, though he knew he would never have the courage to send it. In it, he had written everything he could never say aloud. That he loved her. That she had awakened something in him he had thought impossible. That if the world were different, if he were different, he would choose her in a heartbeat. That he was sorry for his weakness, for his inability to save her, for being bound by vows that now felt like chains rather than wings. He had written that he would pray for her every day for the rest of his life, and that somewhere in eternity, perhaps they would meet again in a place where love was not a sin and duty was not a cage. He held the letter in his hands, this tangible proof of his heart's rebellion, and wondered what would happen if he actually sent it. What would she do with such knowledge? Would it comfort her or torture her? Would it change anything at all? And then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through his window, Thomas made a decision that would alter everything. He stood up, still holding the letter, and he looked at his reflection in the small mirror on the wall. He saw a man in priest's robes, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God, a man who had always chosen duty over desire, obedience over authenticity. And he asked himself the question that would define the rest of his life. If love itself is divine, if compassion is the highest virtue, if we are called to defend the weak and stand against injustice, then what was he doing by allowing Eleanor to be sacrificed? What kind of servant of God stood by while an innocent suffered? What kind of love, divine or otherwise, demanded such cruelty? The sun was rising over Ravenswood. The wedding day had arrived. In the manor, servants were preparing the great hall, hanging garlands and setting tables for the feast. In her chamber, Eleanor was being dressed in her wedding gown, her mother chattering nervously about the honor being bestowed upon them, her hands shaking as she fastened the pearls around Eleanor's throat, pearls that felt like a noose tightening. And in the church, Father Thomas stood before the altar, still holding that letter, still wearing his robes, still bound by his vows. But something had shifted in his eyes. Something had broken and reformed into a new shape entirely. He walked to his cell, removed his clerical collar with hands that no longer trembled, and placed it carefully on the desk beside the letter. Then he put on his simplest clothes, the plain wool tunic and breeches he wore when working in the garden, and he stepped out into the cold morning air. He was no longer Father Thomas Whitmore, priest of St. Michael's Parish. He was simply Thomas. A man who had finally chosen love over fear. A man walking toward either salvation or damnation, and no longer certain there was any difference between the two. The question that remained was this: would Eleanor, when he arrived at her window in the depths of night, have the courage to choose the same? And if she did, if they fled together into the unknown, what price would the world demand for their defiance? What cost would they pay for daring to love in a time and place where such love was the greatest heresy of all? The answer, dear listener, was coming faster than either of them could have imagined. Because in the cold calculus of medieval power, there were those who had been watching, those who had noticed the glances and the tension, those who understood that a scandal was brewing. And they were already moving to crush it before it could bloom into full rebellion. The question is, would they succeed? Chapter 3. Would Eleanor open the window when Thomas came for her, or would fear keep her trapped behind walls of duty and obligation? The answer came in the darkest hours before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and morning. Thomas stood beneath Eleanor's chamber window, his heart hammering so violently he thought it might break through his ribs. He had walked through the sleeping village like a ghost, past the church that had been his home, past the life he was leaving behind with each step. In his hand, he clutched a small stone, preparing to throw it against her window, when suddenly the casement swung open and Eleanor appeared, already dressed in traveling clothes, a small bag clutched in her hands. She had been waiting for him. Somehow, impossibly, she had known he would come. Their eyes met across the darkness, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. She climbed out onto the ledge, and Thomas caught her as she dropped into his arms, holding her for the first time without barriers, without screams, without the crushing weight of impossibility between them. "I knew you would come," she whispered against his chest. "I have been packed and ready since midnight. I could not marry him, Thomas. I would have run alone if I had to, but I prayed you would come." Thomas pulled back to look at her face, this woman who had broken through every defense he had built around his heart. "I have nothing to offer you but uncertainty and hardship. No wealth, no position, no home. I am a priest who has broken his vows, and you are an earl's daughter fleeing her duty. The world will call us sinners and apostates. We will be hunted, condemned, cast out from everything we have ever known." Eleanor smiled, and in the pre-dawn darkness, her face was luminous with something that looked remarkably like joy. "Then we will be sinners together. Now take me away from here, Thomas, before I lose my courage." They fled on horses borrowed from Eleanor's brother, young Thomas Ashford, having crept from the manor to aid their escape, pressing coins into their hands and whispering fierce blessings disguised as goodbyes. The boy had made his choice, had decided that his sister's happiness mattered more than tradition, more than honor, more than all the empty words adults use to justify cruelty. As Thomas and Eleanor galloped into the forest, leaving Ravenswood behind, neither looked back. To look back was to invite doubt, to remember everything they were abandoning, to feel the full weight of what they had done. So they rode forward instead, toward the unknown, toward freedom or damnation, or perhaps both at once. But dawn brings revelation, and with the morning light came discovery. The Earl's household awoke to chaos. Eleanor's chamber was empty, her wedding gown abandoned on the bed like a discarded chrysalis. The servants who went to rouse Father Thomas for the wedding ceremony found his cell vacant, his priestly robes folded neatly on the bed, his collar placed carefully atop them like an offered sacrifice. Sir Gareth Blackthorne, arriving at the manor in his wedding finery, heard the news and his face transformed into something monstrous. His bride had fled. His property had escaped. The humiliation was unendurable. He immediately organized a hunting party, 20 armed men on the fastest horses, and he swore by all that was holy and unholy that he would drag Eleanor back in chains if necessary, and that the priest who had stolen her would hang before sunset. The Earl, confronted with his daughter's defection, stood in her empty chamber and felt the full weight of his failures crash down upon him. He had sold his daughter to pay his debts. He had treated her like currency, like a possession to be traded. And now she had chosen destitution and disgrace over marriage to the man he had selected. What did that say about his judgment? What did that say about his role as a father? Lord Blackthorne arrived shortly after, his face purple with rage, demanding immediate pursuit, threatening to call the debt and destroy the Ashford family utterly unless Eleanor was returned and the wedding completed. The Earl's wife pleaded with her husband to do something, anything, to salvage the situation. But the Earl found himself unable to move, unable to speak, seeing for the first time the prison he had constructed around his daughter's life. Meanwhile, Thomas and Eleanor were racing toward the port town of Bristol, where ships departed daily for France, for Scotland, for anywhere that was not England. They rode hard through the morning, barely stopping to rest the horses, speaking little, conserving their energy for the flight ahead. When they finally paused at a stream to water the animals, Eleanor turned to Thomas and asked the question that had been building in her mind since they fled. "Do you regret it? Breaking your vows? Leaving the church?" Thomas cupped water in his hands, drank deeply, and then looked at her with eyes that held both sorrow and certainty. "I regret that the church made me choose between serving God and loving you, as if the two were incompatible. I regret that you were forced to sacrifice your family for your freedom. But do I regret choosing you? Never. Not for a single moment." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming love for this man who had given up everything for her. But their respite was brief. In the distance, they heard the sound that would haunt their nightmares for years to come, the baying of hunting dogs, the thunder of many horses, the shouts of men in pursuit. Sir Gareth's hunting party was closer than they had feared, tracking them with terrifying efficiency. Thomas and Eleanor mounted immediately, spurring their exhausted horses forward, but they both knew the truth. Their animals were spent. The pursuers were fresh. They would be overtaken before they reached Bristol. The only question was where and when. Thomas made a desperate decision. There, he pointed toward a church rising above the trees. We make our stand there. In God's house, they cannot shed blood without committing sacrilege. It may buy us time. They galloped toward the church of St. Peter, a small parish church in a village whose name they did not even know, and they burst through the doors just as the hunting party rounded the bend behind them. Inside the church, they barricaded the doors with pews, knowing it would hold for only moments. Eleanor was breathing hard, her face flushed from the ride, and Thomas stood beside her, weaponless, powerless, facing the mob that would soon break through. I am not afraid, Eleanor said, and she was surprised to find it was true. Whatever happens now, I chose this. I chose you. I chose myself. That is worth any consequence. Thomas took her hand, and they stood together before the altar as the doors began to splinter under the assault from outside. The hunters were shouting for them to surrender, Sir Gareth's voice rising above the rest, promising mercy if they came out immediately, though everyone knew his promises were lies. The local parish priest, an elderly man named Father Benedict, had been praying in the sanctuary and now emerged, horrified at the violence being done to his church. Stop this, he cried out as the doors finally gave way. This is God's house. You profane it with your weapons and your rage. Sir Gareth Blackthorne strode into the church surrounded by his men, and his eyes found Eleanor with a possessive fury that made her blood run cold. You are my betrothed, he snarled. Your father sold you to me, and I will have what I paid for. Come now, and I may forgive this foolishness. Resist, and I will make you regret the day you were born. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing clear through the sanctuary. I am not your betrothed. I am not property to be bought and sold. I am a free woman making a free choice, and I choose Thomas. I choose love over duty, happiness over obligation, and my own soul over your cruelty. You may drag me back in chains, Sir Gareth, but you will never have my consent, never have my heart, and you will spend your life married to a woman who despises you. The church fell silent. Eleanor's words hung in the air like a benediction or a curse, and everyone present felt the weight of them. Father Benedict, the old priest, looked at Eleanor and Thomas with eyes that had seen much in his long life, and he made a decision that surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. This young woman speaks truth, he said quietly but firmly. She was not asked for her consent in this betrothal. She was sold like cattle. And though this man beside her may have broken his vows to the church, he has not broken God's greatest commandment, which is to love. I will not see violence done in this sanctuary. If you would take her, Sir Gareth, you must do so over my dead body. The old priest stood between Eleanor and Sir Gareth, a fragile shield of righteousness, and something shifted in the energy of the room. But it was not Father Benedict's intervention that would ultimately save them. It was the arrival, moments later, of someone none of them expected. Eleanor's father, the Earl of Ravenswood, burst through the broken church doors, his face haggard from hard riding, his clothes disheveled, and behind him came Eleanor's younger brother. The Earl had ridden after them not to drag Eleanor back, but to stop Sir Gareth from destroying her. Because somewhere on that desperate ride, watching his youngest son risk everything to help his sister escape, the Earl had experienced an awakening. He had seen clearly, perhaps for the first time in decades, what truly mattered. Blackthorne, the Earl's voice boomed through the church. I release my daughter from the betrothal. The arrangement is void. Sir Gareth whirled on him, incredulous. You cannot void what has been contracted. I paid your debt with the promise of marriage. You will honor our agreement or I will destroy you. The Earl walked forward until he stood face to face with the Baron's son, and when he spoke, his voice was steady with the kind of courage that comes from finally choosing what is right over what is expedient. Then destroy me. Take my lands, take my title, take everything I own. But you will not take my daughter. I have already lost her trust, her respect, her love because of my greed and pride. I will not also lose her soul. Eleanor, if you can hear me, I release you. I give you my blessing to choose your own path. And I am sorry, my daughter. I am so desperately sorry for what I tried to do to you. Eleanor stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. Her father, the man who had sold her like property, was setting her free. Was choosing her over his honor, his estate, his very identity as an earl. She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Father, she whispered. The earl opened his arms, and Eleanor ran to him, and for the first time since childhood, her father held her not as a possession but as a beloved daughter. Go, he whispered into her hair. Go with him. Find your happiness. I will face whatever consequences come. Young Thomas Ashford stepped forward, grinning despite the tension. Besides, I have a plan for dealing with Lord Blackthorne. It involves some very interesting information about his dealings with French merchants during the war. Information that the Crown might find very interesting indeed. I may be young, but I am not stupid, and I have been collecting insurance against this family for months. The revelation hung in the air. Sir Gareth's face went from red to white as he realized the trap closing around him. If the boy had evidence of treason, even rumors of such evidence, it could mean his execution, his family's ruin, everything lost. The power balance in the church shifted like sand. Lord Blackthorne, who had arrived moments after his son, assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a man who had survived 3 decades of political maneuvering. Perhaps, he said slowly, an arrangement can still be reached. The debt forgiven in exchange for silence about certain matters. No marriage. No pursuit. We walk away and forget this ever happened. The Earl nodded. Agreed. Just like that, with a few words and a threat, Eleanor's future was returned to her. But the story was far from over. The bishop arrived 3 days later, summoned by reports of a priest abandoning his vows and defiling a noblewoman. He came prepared to excommunicate Thomas, to condemn Eleanor, to make examples of them both as a warning to others who might dare to place personal desires above sacred duty. But what he found instead was a situation far more complicated than his informants had reported. He found Father Benedict, the elderly priest, defending the couple's actions. He found the Earl of Ravenswood supporting his daughter's choice. He found a community divided, with many villagers quietly admiring the courage it took to choose love over obligation. And most troubling of all, he found that the story of Eleanor and Thomas had already begun to spread, whispered from village to village, copied by scribes, discussed in taverns and market squares, becoming something larger than 2 people, becoming a legend about the power of love to challenge unjust authority. The bishop was a practical man. He understood that martyrs were more dangerous than sinners, that persecution could transform a scandal into a rallying cry. So he made a political calculation. He declared that Father Thomas had been released from his vows due to a crisis of faith, that no sin had been committed because technically no adultery had occurred since Eleanor never married Sir Gareth, and that while the situation was irregular, it did not require the full weight of the Church's punishment. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and yet allowed everyone to save face. Thomas would never be a priest again, but he would not be excommunicated. Eleanor had defied convention, but she had not committed any crime the Church could prosecute. They were free to go, though they would never be truly welcomed in polite society again. And so Thomas and Eleanor made their way to Scotland, where the Church's authority was less absolute and where 2 people who loved each other could build a life without quite so many questions about vows and propriety. Thomas found work as a teacher, his theological education making him valuable to families who wanted their sons educated. Eleanor, freed from the constraints of her noble upbringing, discovered she had a gift for writing. She began recording their story, not as a justification but as a simple accounting of what had happened, how they had met, how love had grown in the confessional's darkness, how they had chosen each other over everything else. She wrote it in English rather than Latin, making it accessible to common people, and she had it copied and distributed by sympathetic scribes who saw in their tale something revolutionary, the idea that perhaps individuals had the right to choose their own paths, that perhaps love was not always a sin, that perhaps the institutions meant to guide humanity had sometimes lost their way. Their story spread like wildfire through medieval England and beyond. It was read in secret, discussed in whispers, debated by theologians and common folk alike. Some condemned them as sinners who had corrupted each other. But others, particularly women trapped in loveless marriages and young priests questioning their vocations, found in Eleanor and Thomas's tale a glimmer of hope, a suggestion that the world's rules were not immutable, that courage could carve out space for happiness even in the most rigid of societies. Over the years that followed, there were documented cases of women refusing arranged marriages, citing Eleanor's example. There were priests who left their orders, seeking lives of authentic love rather than enforced celibacy. The church and nobility resisted these changes, of course, but seeds had been planted, ideas had been released into the world, and ideas, once born, are nearly impossible to kill. 10 years later, Thomas and Eleanor sat in the garden of their modest cottage in the Scottish Highlands, watching their 3 children play among the heather. Thomas no longer looked like a priest. His hair was longer, his face weathered by sun and honest labor. Eleanor no longer moved with the careful restraint of a noble woman but with the easy confidence of a woman who had chosen her own life. "Do you think we changed anything?" Eleanor asked, watching their eldest daughter chase butterflies with single-minded determination. "Do you think our story mattered beyond just us?" Thomas considered the question, his hand finding hers by long habit. "I know that last month, a young woman arrived at our door. She had walked for 3 weeks to find us. She said she had read your account of our story, and it had given her the courage to refuse a marriage to a man who beat his first wife to death. She said our story saved her life. So yes, my love. I think we changed something. Perhaps not the whole world, but some small corner of it. And perhaps that is enough." Their story continued to spread for generations, copied and recopied, evolving into legend and myth but never quite losing its essential truth, that 2 people had dared to choose love over fear, freedom over security, and that their choice had rippled outward in ways they could never have fully understood. Historians would later mark their tale as one of many small rebellions that gradually shifted medieval society's understanding of marriage, consent, and individual rights. Their names became synonymous with the idea that sometimes the most sacred duty is not obedience to external authority but faithfulness to one's own heart. And though the church never officially sanctioned their union, though society never fully forgave their transgression, they had something far more valuable. They had each other. They had their children. They had built a life of meaning and love on the ruins of everything they had abandoned. They had proven that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not maintaining tradition but having the courage to create something new. So I ask you now, dear listener, what would you have done in their place? Would you have had the courage to walk away from everything familiar, everything safe, for the mere possibility of authentic love? And in your own life, right now, are there cages you have built around your own heart, duties you maintain out of fear rather than conviction, paths you follow because they are expected rather than because they lead where you truly want to go? Eleanor and Thomas's story is not just a tale from medieval England. It is a question that echoes across the centuries to reach you, right here, right now. What are you willing to risk for the life you actually want? What would you sacrifice for genuine happiness? And perhaps most importantly, what story will you leave behind when your time in this world is done? If this tale has moved you, if it has made you think about love and duty and courage in ways you had not considered before, then do me a favor. Leave a comment below telling me what choice you would have made in Eleanor's position. Would you have climbed out that window, or would you have married Sir Gareth? Would you have opened the door to Thomas, or kept it locked? And while you are there, subscribe to this channel, because we have only just begun to explore the hidden love stories of history, the tales of people who dared to love when the world told them they had no right to do so. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next chapter in our journey through history's most forbidden romances. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is sacred. And remember, the most revolutionary act in any era is simply to love authentically and to build a life that honors your truth rather than someone else's expectations. Until next time, may you have the courage to write your own story, and may it be a tale worth telling.